Welcome. Today, we delve into a moment in history when the race for atomic power teetered on the brink of total catastrophe. August 1945, a period marked by unprecedented scientific achievement and deadly potential. Within that narrow window of time, the third atomic bomb was nearly ready. Its plutonium core, explosive lenses, and warhead components finalized, and just days away from assembly. How close was humanity to a different ending? Could the process have been stopped? And what might have unfolded if that last, devastating weapon had been unleashed? Across the Pacific, new decisions were being made. Targets were evaluated, strategies debated, and the future of Japan, and perhaps of the entire world, hung in the balance. The highest military and political leaders possessed the power to halt the race toward annihilation. But did they have the will? Or was this machinery already set on an irreversible course? A train accelerating toward the edge of destruction? In those blood-stained August days, when the skies over Tokyo and Hiroshima blazed with fire and smoke, and the earth trembled under the weight of devastation, humanity appeared to have reached an unimaginable threshold, a boundary beyond which lay a weapon of unfathomable power. Behind the scenes of visible battles and burning cities, another, quieter drama was unfolding. The completion of the nuclear arsenal that could alter the balance of power for centuries to come. After the two atomic bombs had been dropped, one marking the dawn of a new age, the other still eluding full human comprehension, the production of a third bomb continued methodically. This third weapon was to become the final demonstration of the limitless might that man had conjured with his own hands, a potential final word in forcing Japan's surrender. It was difficult to grasp that, even amid ruin and grief, industrial plants, laboratories, and command centers continued to labor relentlessly toward the perfection of this dangerous creation. The scale of production was staggering for an era in which every minute of delay carried the weight of nations. In Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the secret city hidden among quiet hills and farmland, the delicate work of uranium enrichment proceeded day and night. To the unknowing eye, it was an ordinary landscape. Fields, barns, winding roads. But within sealed buildings, the ordinary was being transmuted into the extraordinary. Common ore was refined into particles of precious, fissionable metal. Thousands of workers performed their tasks without understanding that the dust on their gloves and the hum of generators beneath their feet were shaping a weapon that could level a city in a heartbeat. Far to the west, on the Hanford Plateau of Washington State, the reactors glowed behind heavy shielding. There, the newly created science of reactor engineering extracted plutonium, the element destined to become the heart of the next bomb. Pumps thudded without pause. Instruments traced the invisible birth of nuclear material in grams, milligrams, fractions of a milligram. Meanwhile, in the Mesa laboratories of Los Alamos, the intellectual capital of the Manhattan Project, scientists who had witnessed the Trinity test just weeks earlier were already accelerating production schedules beyond all expectation. In that desert stronghold, engineers refined the explosive lenses that would compress the core. Technicians assembled firing units. Physicists verified data with obsessive precision. The war's end seemed near, but the laboratories continued as if the next detonation were inevitable. According to projections, by the 19th of August, barely 10 days after Japan's surrender, the third core would be ready. It was a high-precision plutonium assembly, already nearing completion, just a few steps from its final integration into a combat-ready bomb. The entire process resembled a game of ultimate stakes, where every movement, every hour, weighed as much as history itself. Between the manufacture of components, their testing, and delivery to the assembly site, every operation was synchronized to the minute. The interval between phases, fabrication, inspection, integration, had been shortened to mere days. Testimony to the extraordinary efficiency of the wartime scientific industrial machine. Once a component was finished, it immediately advanced to the next station: assembly, testing, certification. At the center of this mechanical choreography lay the nuclear heart, the complex plutonium core surrounded by those geometrically perfect explosive lenses and the steel casing of the Fat Man warhead. Each screw, each electrode, each electrical contact had to align flawlessly. A single error could trigger catastrophe. The technical leadership of the project bore a weight beyond comprehension. Their task was not only scientific but existential. Every measure was taken to prevent mishaps that could halt the schedule. In a strategic plan prepared by military command, The use of a third bomb was considered a viable and even likely option. Operational schedules allowed for possible deployment at the end of the summer campaigns of 1945 and even into the autumn and winter, reflecting a grim unwillingness to yield initiative or to allow peace to interrupt momentum. Machines and people alike operated at the limit of endurance. Production was driven with the intensity of war itself, because every minute promised not only technological success, but also the possibility, however tragic, of ending or prolonging mass slaughter. Time, that final resource, was running out. Countdown boards hung on laboratory walls, ticking toward zero, as if foretelling another storm. There was almost no room left for hesitation or delay. Inside this shadow world of atomic creation, technology had fused with logistics into a seamless mechanism of precision. Automatic systems, inspections, coded communications, constant verification. Each element spoke of a single purpose: to forge a weapon that would decide the fate of the world. How realistic was it to halt or delay the preparation of that third atomic bomb? What might have happened if, at that decisive moment, the leadership had chosen to suspend or cancel the operation? Could a shift in political or military strategy have changed the course of history? These were not abstract questions. They defined how fragile the boundaries of possibility were, who controlled the levers behind the scenes, and what, in truth, balanced on the edge of fate. Time was counting its final seconds, and everything suggested that humanity stood on the threshold of a new age, one of annihilation or of salvation. But what cost? At the dawn of the 20th century, the world had entered an era of technological miracles that forever transformed the nature of warfare and statecraft. In the shadow of nuclear progress emerged a new doctrine: to use this weapon not merely to destroy armies, but to shape symbols, to demonstrate supremacy, to crush morale, to rewrite the psychology of nations. The United States, like every major power, sought to apply its newfound strength with maximum effect. During the last months of World War II, this translated into the grim arithmetic of target selection, a meticulous bureaucratic process cloaked in secrecy. Lists of potential strike sites were compiled and revised, blending military logic with political calculation. Behind every name on those lists lay a mixture of industrial data, infrastructure reports, and cold human calculus. The first criterion was strategic significance: which targets, if erased, would cripple Japan's capacity to fight, which transport hubs, arsenals, and industrial centers could bring the enemy to his knees most efficiently. The second was visibility and previous damage. Cities already ravaged by conventional raids were of little value for assessing the psychological and physical impact of a single atomic strike. The bomb had to fall where its full effect could be measured. And finally came symbolic value: locations whose destruction would reverberate through the consciousness of a nation, perhaps breaking its will more effectively than 100 battles. Thus, by early summer 1945, a short list emerged: Hiroshima, Kokura, Nagasaki, Kyoto, and Tokyo, each representing a distinct combination of military, industrial, and cultural weight. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, both manufacturing centers with large military depots and transport facilities, fit the operational requirements. Tokyo, the capital, embodied political and imperial authority. And Kyoto, the ancient seat of culture, religion, and history, represented something entirely different: the soul of Japan. Initially, Kyoto ranked among the primary candidates. It was large, undefended by anti-aircraft installations, and had suffered little damage from previous raids. Yet one man's conviction would alter that destiny. U.S. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who had visited Kyoto before the war and admired its cultural heritage, intervened personally. He insisted that Kyoto be spared, not merely for its temples and history, but to preserve a moral boundary in an increasingly amoral conflict. To obliterate Japan's spiritual center, he argued, would poison any future reconciliation. This act of restraint stands as one of the rare human gestures amid the cold logic of total war. Thanks to Stimson, Kyoto was struck from the list. But the process of selection did not end. The military machine demanded measurable results, and new alternatives, Kokura, Nagasaki, were inserted in its place. When the first bomb annihilated Hiroshima and the second devastated Nagasaki, military analysts and policymakers convened once more to evaluate the effectiveness of atomic warfare. Data poured in: blast radius, casualty ratios, structural damage, radiation dispersion. But beyond numbers lay the unspoken question. Had the goal been achieved? And if not, what would come next? Tokyo remained under consideration. To the planners of the U.S. Army Air Forces, it was the ultimate symbol, the heart of the empire, the seat of Emperor Hirohito, and the center of command and morale. Destroying it would signify absolute dominance. A direct strike on the capital would not merely dismantle infrastructure. It would shatter Japan's identity and belief in its own divinity. Documents and post-war analyses reveal that this scenario was not a fantasy. Within the analytical groups at Los Alamos and the Air Force Command, models existed for what an atomic strike on Tokyo would entail. Projected casualties in the hundreds of thousands, a blast radius stretching from the Imperial Palace to the Sumida River, and a psychological shock designed to erase resistance. In the eyes of strategists, such a blow could fracture the imperial hierarchy, crush morale, and force immediate surrender. But to others, even within the same government, it carried an unbearable moral weight. Tokyo's destruction would have meant the death of a civilization's core, the obliteration of its history, art, and spirit. Would that have accelerated surrender or unleashed deeper, uncontrollable defiance? That question divided minds in Washington and on Pacific bases alike. Some argued that another detonation was essential to prove inevitability. Others feared it would cross a line that humanity could never uncross. Why, then, did Tokyo remain a top priority in the war planners' documents? Because for many, victory was not only about ending the war, it was about establishing the post-war order. The destruction of Japan's capital, the erasure of its imperial symbol, would have proclaimed a single, indelible message. Resistance to American supremacy was futile. Such reasoning reveals the dual nature of the atomic age from its very birth. Every scientific breakthrough carried within it a political agenda. Every technological marvel could become an ethical abyss. The debate over targets thus transcended logistics. It became a mirror of civilization's conscience, a contest between strategic necessity and moral restraint. The names on that list, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Kyoto, Tokyo, were not mere coordinates. They represented entire philosophies of warfare and governance, the boundaries of reason and the limits of humanity itself. In the cold rooms where these decisions were made, men measured not only blast radii, but the value of human life. To them, the third bomb was a tool, an experiment in deterrence and demonstration. Yet history would remember it differently, as the weapon that could have ended far more than a war. The question remains, if that third bomb had been unleashed, if Tokyo had become its target, how would our world look today? Would the moral architecture of modern civilization have survived such a blow? Would the language of diplomacy, law, or mercy still mean anything after that moment? The story of the atomic target lists is more than an account of strategy. It is a revelation of the human struggle between logic and conscience, domination and restraint. In those silent rooms of 1945, power weighed itself against ethics, and the outcome defined the rest of the century. Because behind every calculation, behind every coordinate and map, there stood an unspoken truth. The fate of millions hinged on the moral balance of a handful of men. In the dead silence of night, as the last reflections of day sank below the horizon, the heart of the American command pulsed with quiet intensity. Within a dimly lit office in Washington, General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, sat motionless at his desk. The soft hum of the ceiling lamp cast faint light across maps, diagrams, and folders stamped top secret. Each document before him testified to a single truth. The authority to launch a third atomic bomb now rested in his hands. Arnold's expression betrayed neither triumph nor doubt, only exhaustion. His calmness concealed the weight of an unspoken moral burden. Behind the confident facade of America's military machine stood a man forced to confront the edge between power and madness, reason and annihilation. An order dated July 15, 1945, granted Arnold the right to authorize further nuclear strikes without consulting the president. The directive, issued under the highest classification, was simple and chilling. Once additional atomic bombs became available, the commander of the Air Forces could deploy them as necessary against suitable targets. It was the invisible line between war and apocalypse, a delegation of ultimate authority to a single man. No additional approval from Truman was required. No diplomatic checks, no pause for moral debate. The decision was effectively automated, an operational mechanism poised to continue the cycle of atomic attacks until resistance ceased or until no targets remained. This directive was the culmination of the most secret bureaucratic process of the war. Within its few paragraphs, humanity's fate had been reduced to an administrative clause. For all practical purposes, the third bomb, already nearing completion, could be loaded, armed, and delivered on Arnold's command alone. In underground storage vaults on the American mainland, the new weapon lay almost ready, its components tested, its circuits verified, its plutonium core encased within steel and lead. It represented the apex of wartime science, a symbol of victory through total destruction. Engineers described it as an improved Fat Man, optimized for reliability and yield. It was more stable, more efficient, and capable of obliterating a metropolis in an instant. By early September, production of additional cores was proceeding on schedule. Within weeks, the United States would possess a small but growing nuclear stockpile, enough to deliver 2 to 3 strikes per week, according to internal memoranda. Across the ocean, on the island of Tinian in the northern Marianas, the forward base for the 509th Composite Group, crews were preparing as if the next mission were already assigned. The runways baked under the Pacific sun, while the silver bodies of B-29 super fortresses gleamed like ghosts of steel. Technicians calibrated bomb sites, navigators rehearsed routes, and ground teams inspected refrigeration units designed to maintain the delicate firing systems at optimal temperature. Every mechanism was in place. Communications networks linked Washington, Los Alamos, and Tinian with unbroken precision. Operational manuals outlined procedures for loading, arming, and releasing the bomb. In short, the system was ready. The question was no longer how to deliver the next atomic weapon, but whether anyone would dare to stop it. As the war in the Pacific drew to its end, American logistics had achieved a degree of perfection bordering on automation. Once the political signal was given, the execution would require only hours. From the perspective of the Air Force Command, this efficiency was triumph. From the perspective of history, it was terror in motion. Beneath the surface of military readiness lay the deeper, quieter struggle of conscience. The machinery of annihilation had reached the point where it no longer needed moral direction. It could function on its own momentum. Inside those sealed vaults and hangars, the world's first self-sustaining system of mass destruction had been born. In theory, the order to drop the third bomb could have been transmitted in a single coded message. Within 24 hours, the bomb would be assembled, transported, and loaded aboard a waiting aircraft. Within 48, another city would vanish. What prevented that from happening? Politics or morality? The machine was flawless. The pilots were trained. The coordinates were known. Only the voice of command was missing. In those days of August 1945, that silence was deafening. Few outside the highest circles of government knew of this authority, and fewer still comprehended its implications. Among those who did, the division ran deep. Some generals believed continued use of atomic weapons was necessary to ensure unconditional surrender and to demonstrate supremacy before the Soviet Union. Others argued that even one more detonation would destroy the moral foundation of victory itself. By the last week of August, arguments within the Joint Chiefs had reached a fever pitch. Some saw the bomb as the quickest road to total peace. Others saw it as the first step toward permanent war. Arnold himself, disciplined, pragmatic, yet weary, understood the paradox. The same command that had brought victory now confronted a question no strategy manual could answer. Who will stop the machine once it has been built to run without stopping? The psychological gravity of that moment is impossible to exaggerate. For the first time in history, humankind had created a weapon so powerful that even its possessors feared to use it, and yet could not resist preparing for the next strike. It was the dawn of an age when power outpaced responsibility, when science moved faster than morality, when the instruments of annihilation awaited orders that no one dared to give. And in that suspended moment, between victory and catastrophe, the world's future balanced on a single point of hesitation. At the heart of that historical impasse lay a question that no technical innovation could resolve. What could possibly have made the leaders stop? What moral boundaries, what crises of conscience, what private fears or lingering humanity could have halted the momentum of a system already in motion? In August 1945, these were no longer theoretical musings. They were the living dilemmas of men who held the fate of the world in their hands. Each had to decide whether victory was worth the price of obliterating civilization's last restraint. For the first time, politics, ethics, and technology converged into a single, unbearable decision point. Was the continuation of nuclear strikes truly necessary to secure surrender? Or had it become a demonstration of power, an experiment in global dominance? Historians would later argue that by mid-August, the third bomb was not halted by design, but by circumstance. Japan's surrender intervened before the system could act. Yet within that brief interval, those few days of uncertainty, the entire destiny of modern humanity balanced on hesitation. Had the U.S. command chosen otherwise, had the bomb been used once more, the moral architecture of the post-war world might never have formed. The idea of humanitarian limits, of war crimes, of international law, none of it would have survived the spectacle of a third annihilation. The problem was deeper than politics. The machine of war, the vast industrial scientific complex built to deliver destruction, had acquired its own momentum, independent of conscience or command. Scientists calculated yields, officers refined logistics, policymakers debated symbolism. The system no longer required conviction. It required only inertia. Thus, the final question emerged. Who could stop a mechanism that no longer needed human will to operate? In those months, silence filled the rooms of command as heavily as the hum of generators in underground bunkers. Some saw the growing nuclear arsenal as a guarantee of peace through fear. Others recognized it as a trap, a chain reaction that would enslave every future generation to the logic of deterrence. Between these two visions stretched the thin thread of human reason. It was there, in the uneasy pause between Hiroshima and what might have followed, that the moral dimension of power revealed itself. To win a war, men had built the most efficient killing device in history. But to remain human, they had to learn how not to use it. This tension between victory and restraint defined the twilight of 1945. Inside the Pentagon and the White House, discussions continued under the guise of strategy, but their substance was spiritual. How to retain humanity while wielding the power of gods. The scientists of Los Alamos, once intoxicated by discovery, now wrote letters pleading for control and oversight. Physicists who had raced against time to finish the bomb before the Nazis now begged for a moratorium on further use. Some proposed international regulation. Others simply feared what they had unleashed. Their appeals rarely reached policymakers. The machinery of classified operations was designed to suppress doubt, not to accommodate it. Yet those private confessions, recorded in diaries and memoranda, reveal a chilling unity of awareness. They had opened a door that could never again be closed. In that awareness lay the seed of the Cold War. The new era where peace would exist only as the absence of annihilation. The leadership faced a paradox. To maintain control, they had to continue production. To save the world, they had to restrain it. Between those imperatives stretched a moral vacuum, a silence so dense that it could swallow reason itself. And so the ultimate conflict of that time was not fought in the skies over Japan, nor in the laboratories of New Mexico, but in the minds of those few who understood what they had built. It was a war between conscience and command, between faith in progress and fear of extinction. Some historians describe these days as the moment when human civilization glimpsed its own fragility, the recognition that intelligence and destruction were now inseparable twins. Others argue that this revelation was the true beginning of the modern age, the moment when power demanded self-limitation. Yet in August 1945, such understanding was still fragile. Bureaucracy moved faster than philosophy. Plans for new cores, new bombs, and new delivery systems advanced as if nothing had changed. Each signature, each requisition form carried humanity one step closer to the abyss. The paradox of victory was complete. The war was over, but the machinery of war had achieved immortality. When the generals left their offices and the scientists sealed their laboratories for the night, the silence that followed was not peace. It was the echo of an unfinished question. Who will stop the machine of death when all its parts are ready to begin? That question, born in 1945, has never truly been answered. It lingers beneath every treaty, every arsenal, every doctrine of deterrence. It is the quiet shadow behind progress, the voice that reminds us that invention without morality leads not to triumph, but to extinction. In the shadowed corridors of a nation on the brink, far from the burning ruins of its cities, another battle was being fought, one that unfolded not on the fields of war, but within the halls of power. Japan, August 1945, a country in agony, its armies shattered, its cities burned to ash, and its people trapped between devotion and despair. Yet inside Tokyo's imperial compound, a quieter struggle consumed the hearts of those who still governed. This was not the war of soldiers. It was a war of decisions, a contest of wills between generals who refused to surrender and a monarch who had begun to glimpse the limits of destruction. By that time, Japan's leadership was deeply divided. Within the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, the so-called Big Six, 3 members, led by War Minister Korechika Anami, demanded continuation of the fight. They believed that surrender, especially unconditional surrender, would mean the annihilation of the emperor's divine status and the disgrace of the nation. Others, like Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, saw the futility. He argued that the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not merely military defeats. They were signs that resistance had crossed into suicide. But between these two poles stood one man whose voice had rarely been heard publicly during the entire war, Emperor Hirohito. Until then, his role had been ritual, almost spectral, the sacred figurehead of an empire dying in his name. Yet as the flames of war reached the heart of Tokyo, that silence broke. In the nights between August 10th and August 14th, Hirohito held a series of meetings that historians later called the Sacred Decision Conferences. Witnesses described the scene in the imperial study, low light filtering through paper screens, the air heavy with the smell of ink and incense. Advisors whispered, generals bowed stiffly, and all eyes turned toward a man whose words could decide life or death for millions. Hirohito listened as the ministers spoke. Each offered a vision of Japan's future, either one last, desperate battle or immediate surrender. Their arguments were saturated with pride, fear, and honor. When they finished, the emperor rose. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded a prepared note. Then, in a soft, steady voice, he spoke. Continuing the war will only result in the destruction of the Japanese people. We must bear the unbearable and endure the unendurable. Those who heard him that night realized that the decision was final. The divine sovereign, whom they had vowed to protect at any cost, was now commanding them to stop fighting. The room fell silent. Even the most hardened officers, men who had sworn to die before surrender, could not defy the voice they believed to be of divine origin. The will of the emperor became the will of Japan. Hirohito's order was more than a political act. It was a moral fracture in the foundation of a militarized nation. He had chosen peace over divinity, responsibility over myth. For the first time, the embodiment of Japan's sacred authority had intervened directly in state policy, not to wage war, but to end it. The following days were filled with quiet chaos. Coup attempts flickered among extremist officers determined to silence the emperor before his surrender broadcast could air. In the early hours of August 15th, a group of rebels infiltrated the imperial palace, searching for the phonograph recording of his speech. They intended to destroy it and seize power, but they failed. Loyal guards protected the recording, and as dawn broke, the conspirators realized the futility of resistance. Hours later, across Japan, radios crackled to life. For the first time in history, the Japanese people heard their emperor's voice. The transmission was formal, poetic, and obscure, yet its meaning was unmistakable. Hirohito announced that Japan would accept the provisions of the joint declaration of the Allied powers. Many listeners wept. Others stared in disbelief. Some could not understand the archaic court language, but they felt the gravity of his tone. The unthinkable had happened. The divine ruler had ordered the end of the war. In that moment, a nation built upon the cult of death and sacrifice confronted the voice of life. The shock rippled through every layer of society. Soldiers in Manchuria laid down their arms. Kamikaze pilots awaiting orders stood frozen on the tarmac. Civilians in bombed-out cities sank to their knees. Inside the War Council, resistance evaporated. Even the die-hard militarists recognized that disobedience now meant not defiance, but blasphemy. Within hours, formal instructions for surrender were dispatched to the Allied command. What had taken years of warfare, millions of deaths, and 2 atomic blasts to achieve was now sealed by a single voice on a fragile gramophone record. For Hirohito, This was not merely an act of political calculation. It was an act of personal courage. In choosing surrender, he defied the very structure that had deified him. The same imperial system that demanded eternal war now bent before its own creation. The significance of that act cannot be overstated. By asserting his authority to end the conflict, Hirohito not only saved his people from further destruction, but also prevented the detonation of additional atomic bombs that were already prepared for deployment. Behind the silence that followed his broadcast, a single truth emerged. Japan's surrender was not just the end of the Second World War. It was the moment when humanity stepped back from the brink. In the shadow of the event that forever changed the face of the world, there lies one of history's greatest untold stories. The fate of the third atomic bomb that was never used. Its components had been prepared, its logistics mapped, its delivery system rehearsed. Yet destiny intervened. Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, halted its mission at the very edge of execution. When Emperor Hirohito's broadcast reached the world, technicians in Los Alamos, Hanford, and Oak Ridge were still at their stations. Some wept in relief. Others stared blankly at the instruments that had guided their work for years. In hidden laboratories and fortified bunkers, the machinery of creation slowed, but it did not stop. The plutonium cores, forged for war, were carefully packed into lead containers and transported under armed escort to California. There, in storage facilities meant for weapons awaiting deployment, they waited, symbols of a power that had already surpassed its battlefield purpose. What was to become of them? In the months that followed Japan's surrender, the American nuclear program did not dissolve. It shifted direction. The new mission was not destruction, but demonstration, testing, measurement, and control. The third bomb and its successors would no longer fall on cities, but on islands, specifically the atolls of the Pacific. Thus began the next chapter, the bikini tests. Among the palm trees and coral lagoons of the Marshall Islands, the same fire that had consumed Hiroshima was reborn in the name of science. Ships, tanks, and aircraft were anchored in circles around the blast sites. Cameras and sensors waited to record the rebirth of annihilation. These were not simply experiments. They were the continuation of war by other means, a demonstration to the world, and especially to the Soviet Union, that the United States now possessed a weapon capable of ending any future conflict before it began. The production of nuclear cores never ceased. Each new refinement brought higher efficiency, greater stability, and, with it, the growing illusion of control. By 1946, several additional bombs were ready. By 1947, industrial-scale production was underway. America had become the first nation in history not only to use atomic weapons, but to possess a system for producing them continuously. It was an achievement and a curse, a triumph of engineering and a moral wound that would never fully heal. The unused cores, once destined for Japan, were reclassified as experimental material. They became test subjects in explosions that vaporized fleets, poisoned lagoons, and reshaped the very fabric of the Earth's atmosphere. The third bomb, now a symbol of restraint, was reborn as the seed of the arms race. In official documents, the transformation seemed clinical. Item reallocated for test detonation, Operation Crossroads, Bikini Atoll. But behind those sterile lines lay the beginning of a new kind of war, a war of numbers, thresholds, and deterrence. What had been conceived as a weapon to end one conflict became the foundation of a world divided by fear. The moral line that had held back the third bomb in 1945 soon blurred beneath the pressures of geopolitics. The success of Japan's surrender, secured by the emperor's intervention, saved millions of lives. Yet it also diverted nuclear history onto a different track. Instead of more destruction, there came a race for dominance. Nations realized that possessing the bomb mattered more than using it. Power now resided in the mere potential for annihilation. By the late 1940s, this logic had become the central doctrine of global politics, deterrence. The bomb, once a means of victory, became the guarantor of peace through mutual terror. Knowledge that had once been confined to a few American laboratories spread rapidly. British and Soviet scientists developed their own programs. Within a few years, nuclear technology leapt across borders, copied, stolen, or independently rediscovered. The monopoly vanished, replaced by a precarious balance of power. Thus, from the silence of the third bomb arose the nuclear age, a time when humanity learned to coexist with its own extinction. Each new detonation, whether in Nevada, Semipalatinsk, or the Pacific, was both a scientific triumph and a ritual of fear. Every mushroom cloud reminded the world of the invisible decision made in August 1945, the choice to stop, once, and to never again let the process complete itself. And yet, the factories never slept. Even as treaties were drafted and peace was declared, production continued. The logic of deterrence demanded it. Each generation built upon the last, not to destroy, but to prepare for destruction. Historians later debated what might have happened if the third bomb had been used, if Tokyo, Osaka, or Kyoto had joined Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the flames. Would the horror have been so total that the world would have recoiled from nuclear weapons forever? Or would it have normalized annihilation as just another instrument of policy? No one can say. But one fact is certain. The third bomb, by remaining unused, became more powerful than if it had fallen. Its absence reshaped the world as much as its explosion would have. The existence of that unspent core gave rise to the cold logic of the 20th century, a logic that replaced courage with calculation, morality with deterrence, and peace with balance. From that moment onward, human civilization entered a new paradox. To survive, it had to live under the constant threat of its own destruction. Through the fog of history, beyond the fire and silence of 1945, the true legacy of the atomic age reveals itself. Not in explosions, but in hesitation. It was not the blast that defined civilization's future, but the single, invisible moment when men chose not to release it again. For decades after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, humanity stood balanced on the knife edge of annihilation. The Cold War transformed that balance into a permanent condition. The bomb that never fell became the foundation of global strategy, the unspoken axis of all diplomacy, the silent hostage inside every negotiation. Every leader who held nuclear codes thereafter inherited the same dilemma faced in August 1945, whether to trust reason over fear. The calculus of survival no longer belonged to generals alone. It became the burden of all mankind. The unused bomb, that unspent core of plutonium sealed away instead of detonated, became a mirror for the human conscience. It asked a question no weapon had ever asked before. Could intelligence coexist with destruction? Could power restrain itself? This was the essence of the nuclear paradox. Progress had given humanity the tools of its own extinction and demanded that it never use them. In conference rooms and bunkers, that paradox took form as doctrine. Mutual assured destruction, the planners called it, a phrase both clinical and terrifying. Peace itself was now an equation of terror. If no one could survive a war, no one would start one. Thus, the moral responsibility once held by a handful of scientists and statesmen expanded until it encompassed the entire species. Every treaty, every missile, every launch key was a reminder that civilization's survival depended not on strength, but on self-control. And yet, self-control is the rarest of powers. It demands clarity in moments of panic, humility in the face of triumph, and compassion amid strategy. In the decades that followed, crises in Cuba, Korea, and the Middle East tested that restraint again and again. Each time, the world stepped back, sometimes by wisdom, sometimes by accident. Historians often ask whether humanity truly learned the lesson of 1945 or merely postponed the next catastrophe. The evidence is mixed. The arsenals grew, the doctrines multiplied, but alongside them grew something equally vital, the recognition that survival is a choice, not a guarantee. The third bomb, unfired, unseen, became the silent teacher of that truth. Its shadow reached farther than its light ever could have. It reminded nations that knowledge carries debt, that invention demands conscience, and that civilization endures only as long as it remembers fear. In this sense, the nuclear age did not begin with the explosion over Hiroshima. It began with the decision to stop. That decision, made in secrecy and hesitation, was the first act of global self-preservation in recorded history. The lesson endures. Power without restraint is extinction. Restraint without wisdom is surrender. But power with conscience, rare, fragile, deliberate, is the only path through the darkness we created for ourselves. When we look back on those days, on the silent warehouses where the unused cores were sealed, we do not see weapons. We see mirrors. They reflect the narrow boundary between creation and destruction, genius and madness, victory and suicide. The atomic age did not end the world. It forced the world to know itself. And so, in the quiet that followed the thunder, amid the ruins and the rebuilding, one truth emerged. The same truth that still governs every era of power. Humanity survives not because of the strength it wields, but because of the strength it refuses to use.